Well, good morning, folks. We'll go ahead and get started and talk about raised bed gardening on the ground. Now, I'm going to kind of walk you through from start to finish as if you had just a bare patch of grass or dirt or weeds or picked out a spot in your yard. And with that, the biggest two things to consider, if you've done any of the classes or watched any of the videos, come out and ask questions. The two biggest things for growing herbs and vegetables and flowers successfully is full sun and well-drained soil. So raised beds from the beginning allow pretty easy access to pretty good results. And what I mean by that is, traditionally gardening is sweat equity into the dirt, yielding better and better results as the years roll on. And that is kind of shortened. That speed with which you get to the good results is very much quickened, if not the first year for sure, into the second year. And a nice way to get gardening very, very quickly with good results. The catch is the cost on the front end. And what I mean by that is you've got to buy the dirt, you've got to buy the bed itself or make the bed out of something, and then you've got the plant cost as well and the fertilizers and that kind of thing. So a little bit more expensive to get set up, but again, if you're after quick results and quick return, really a nice way to go about it, especially being that the bed itself doesn't have to be expensive. If you're not going to buy it, you're going to use recycled materials or old windows or blocks or logs or something like that. You can get out of it fairly cheaply. And then if you've got yourself a pickup truck or access to one, bulk loads of dirt aren't too expensive in the long run either. So the full sun and the well-drained soil we'll get to in just a moment. The soil makeup really forms the foundation. And that's, again, the full sun and the well-drained soil is about 80% of your success rate. So those two things are the biggest things to consider. And as we talk through, kind of see where you're at with the full sun, the drainage, I'll give you the components for that in just a moment. But those two things being the biggest, the two biggest components, for your success, it really is the soil makeup that forms the foundation of your garden, which is what everything is obviously planted in. So third mix. So a third topsoil, a third compost, and a third sand. Now, the topsoil and compost is pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. Not many questions about that. We do often get asked about the sand. And I know it might seem a little odd to begin with, but the sand is such a huge component of your drainage. Now, the topsoil and the compost is obviously, with those two, fairly readily available and pretty easily recognized to be the foundation of any soil. That's nice because they're easy to get and most everyone starts with that. The sand component, however, really allows your plants to drain. And what that's going to do for them is have them grow quicker and not being over-fertilized. So if you over-fertilize a plant, it will grow nice and big. Let's take a tomato plant. You get nice and big, a lot of green foliage and leaves, but very little fruit. So if you over-fertilize plants, especially edible plants, usually they reward you with growth, but not the type of growth that's kind of long-term. So if you think of a basil or a mint or an oregano, again, a lot of growth, somewhat of a wishy-washy flavor because it's not kind of moved along the growth cycles of root growth, top growth, setting the oil in the plant and all things growing proportionally like that. So we'll get to all of that in a little bit. But as far as the sand goes, the sand is an excellent component for your drainage, which will make your plant root out because as the soil dries out, it's obviously going to think it's not getting watered again. So it's going to search out for more water, come across more nutrients naturally all on its own, and actually grow you a healthier, more robust plant for those reasons. So the sand is not beach sand or play sand or paver sand. It's not the very fine sand that you find almost everywhere. You really need a nice coarse grain. For that, usually you have to go to like a landscape supply company that sells bulk loads. Now, some of them will let you take some 5-gallon buckets. You drive across the scale, fill up your 5-gallon buckets in your trunk, and then drive out, especially if you're only doing one bed or two beds kind of thing. Sometimes bulk loads can be a little more problematic getting delivered, getting that area messy, wheelbarrows back and forth. We have the raised bed mix in the bag at the farm. It's just if you're going to use that to fill, let's say, a 6x4 bed that's 12 inches deep, it's going to cost you quite a bit of money. So bulk loads are definitely a lot cheaper, especially if you're doing multiple beds, and it's going to, again, put more or keep more money in your pocket. So back to the components. So the topsoil, the sand, and the compost. Now, compost is not fertilizer. It's not chicken manure, horse manure, cow, rabbit, anything like that. Compost is just your broken down leaf material, your broken down kitchen scraps, and that nice kind of uniform blend of all those trace minerals and elements, a little bit of fertilizer in there to get your plant started. But really, there's quite a big difference between a compost, which is really a soil amendment for the health of your soil, versus a fertilizer that actually just straight up feeds your plants. So fertilizer doesn't add to the structure of your soil, and a compost that adds to the structure of your soil really isn't a fertilizer. So in making up the bed of that third blend, don't get confused about adding fertilizer as part of the component for the actual soil structure. Mix that all in, keep it all nice and uniform all the way throughout. No layering, just mix it all up so it's nice and uniform from top to bottom. And then really the depth is another component at the beginning before we get started to talk about. So 6 inches of depth is okay. You're going to grow all of your herbs in that. Some of your vegetables, a tomato plant, being so big, is actually going to take up more space across the bed and more of your real estate than if you had the depth. So a nice depth to start with is 12 inches, but sometimes 12 inches is too much and you can add to it later. So again, 6 inches will get you off and started. 12 inches is better. Really, the only time you need to go deeper than 12 is when you're growing root vegetables, let's say carrots, because again, they're the carrot and then the taproot. So 18 inches, 24 inches kind of thing for those. But again, 6 inches onto 12 doubles your cost. 12 to 18 to 24 just keeps adding more cost. So keep those things in balance as far as how much you're investing as to how much you're going to get returned. Carrots might be nice to grow, but if that's the only reason you're adding another 6 to 12 inches of depth, it might just be more cost effective to get another bed and to grow more vegetables of the other things, and that will yield you back your investment quicker. So again, that third blend, the sand is probably the standout. Nice, big, coarse grain. You should be able to look at it in your hand and pick it up and kind of see each grain and count them kind of thing. They should be a really nice coarse grain because the coarser, the better. But that doesn't delve into then adding gravel, pea gravel, and things like that. Really just stick with your sand and try to find the sand is the best way to go. So now you've got your third blend, your topsoil, compost, and sand. You've got all that mixed up. You've got your bed. And again, making your bed can be pretty much anything you're comfortable with making it out of. We've got it's a powder-coated metal that clicks together. There's no tools. It's together in maybe 5 or 10 minutes, which is actually set up on the ground quick and nice and easy, and that's 12 inches deep. I think it's a 4x2. So in looking at your sizes of your beds, bigger is not always better. Reason being is it's better to have not smaller beds, but beds, multiple beds, to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 beds as opposed to one big giant one. And the reason being is most of your vines, your tomatoes, your squashes, your zucchini, your cucumbers, you want to be able to rotate them from one bed to another, to another, to another, with really a 4-year rotation cycle. And what I mean by that is instead of having it in one area of the bed and moving it to the other end in the same bed, it's actually better year after year after year if you can take it from that one bed, plant it in that bed the first year, then move them to another bed, a whole separate bed. Again, because those are pretty prone to soil diseases, and the soil diseases will build up in the soil year after year and eventually take out your plants once that balance tips. So avoid that with multiple beds. If you don't have the luxury of multiple beds, you're just starting out with one, and that's kind of enough for you, the space that you have, that kind of thing. You can grow them in containers. Think of a 5-gallon bucket for all of those kind of things for one plant, because that'll give you a good amount of root space and nutrient area for that plant to pull from. And then put it in the bed the next year, the container the next year, and back and forth. I do realize that's a 2-year rotation, but that's better than putting it in the same spot year after year after year. Your peppers, those kind of things don't need to worry about rotating. You can keep those in the same. But again, more beds, the better for your crop rotation. So with that, what size? Well, usually you can make it any size that you want. You probably don't want to go much deeper or wider than a 4-foot width. So if the bed is, let's say, 6 feet or 8 feet or 20 feet long, all of that works. The depth of it from front to back, you really don't want more than 4 feet, because they're really not designed for you to get up into the bed to be working and harvesting. Raised beds are really just premium planting real estate. They should be treated as a factory in the sense of you put in your plants, you put in your fertilizer, water, and your care, and they produce the food for you, and that's what you take in the house and eat. So with that in mind, they should be as in the process of producing for you as much as you possibly can. So on the size of the bed, really not a big concern. But again, the depth, you really don't want to be getting up in there. So about a 4-foot depth from front to back allows you to reach in there without having too much trouble. And again, not having to get up into the bed. So that kind of, that 4-foot depth is pretty standard. Most of your beds are something by, 2 feet or 4 feet. They usually don't go much further than that. Pardon me. And again, the length of your bed, it's really up to you. But if you can break it up, so if you had a 20-foot by 4-foot area, you could get 3 6x4s in there pretty nicely. And again, you could, or 4 4x4s for your crop rotation to be, the more optimum for that. So that's kind of the sizes that you're after. The sun, the full sun, is really what the plants are after. Again, it's a production facility. So the more sun you have, the more produce you're going to get from that. If you don't have full sun, so things to consider is grow a plant that you can eat from quicker than having to wait. So if you think of cabbage, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, you think of tomatoes, you think of big full-size peppers, those kind of things do take some time. So if you've got limited sun, the small snack peppers would be better. A small cherry tomato plant would yield you more tomatoes in the sense of more pound for pound. Again, if cherries aren't your thing and full-size tomatoes are it, or nothing at all, grow yourself a full-size tomato and get some off it like that. Kale, spinach, lettuce, any of your greens as opposed to cabbage and broccoli, because again, those things you're going to be eating on almost immediately upon planting, and they're going to continue to grow and grow and grow, even in those lower light conditions. Now, where's kind of the border and the boundary of how much light actually do you need to get started? Well, any amount of sunlight's going to work for you. You're just going to have to trial and error things. So rosemary, thyme, oregano, sage, those 4 take the lowest light. Rosemary, thyme, oregano, and sage. Those take the lowest light of all of your herb plants. So if you've got very low light, very indirect sun, you start with those. If you're happy with your return on investment on those, then go ahead and branch out to your parsley, your basil, and all the other things that you want to grow too. And that'll get you started in the sense of if you really have very, very low light, and surely don't want you spending a whole bunch of money on things that just aren't going to do well for you. So if you start small with a few of those things, if you're happy again with those, then branch out into other things. And that'll kind of give you a good idea of, how quickly things regrow. Because on those leafy ones, they're going to stretch and get leggy and then they start to look a little ugly too. So again, basil still tastes like basil if you've got 3 leaves on the plant or 150. But again, that return on investment, especially at the moment, it's a good idea to kind of keep that in focus, because again, especially on a raised bed, your cost is at the front. It's front loaded with your cost. But try to think of a bed, especially with the bed itself and the soil. Try to think of those things over the life of the bed. So if you make it out of cedar, like the heart, the redwood kind of heart part of the cedar, you're usually going to get about 10 years out of that bed, 10 to 12 years. The soil itself, so let's take an 8x4, sorry. We have some 8x4 beds here at the farm. Those beds themselves, 2x6 boards, 8x4 with 12 inches of depth. That bed was just over $200 to buy. The soil itself was probably around $80. So let's say it was a $300 investment for the bed. So again, over a 10-year process, let's say on the shorter end of that time frame, so $30 a year. And then with that in mind, that $30 per year for that bed should yield you spring plants, summer plants, and fall plants. So essentially $10 a season for an 8x4, 12 inches deep. So again, compared to a container, that's usually, let's say, $10 to $15 if it's plastic, more if it's glazed. The potting mix itself, you're pretty much already at $30 for a 12 by 12 by 12 kind of container. So again, a lot more planting real estate on a raised bed, but again, a lot more cost and work on the front end. So with that in mind, let's go and kind of recap before we get started on the growing. So the bed itself, full sun, well-drained soil, topsoil, compost, and sand of equal parts. What do I do if I have grass or weeds or something there? It's bare dirt or whatever before I get started. So the process is get rid of the grass or the weeds. If you put nice dirt on top of those, they're going to thank you by growing and taking over more of your yard. So get rid of them any way that you can, any way that you're comfortable with, any way that you want to do it. And then once you've got that area kind of bare dirt now, you want to go ahead and put down some mole and vole protection. We didn't have a problem years ago, and now we do. So quite thankful we put that wire mesh down now instead of having to dig the bed out, then put the mesh down, then put all the dirt back into the bed. So it's just 1/2 inch square galvanized wire, and that goes on the ground, and then your bed sits on top of that. So make sure there's a seal. You don't have to go to the extent of stapling it all onto the bottom of your bed or anything like that. You surely can. But the weight of the bed itself sitting on top of that is going to seal it as long as that mesh comes. So the bed itself here, the mesh here. So with it, at least the bed sitting on the mesh. Sorry, it's just getting used to the camera angles. But the bed itself should sit on that mesh and seal it. We often get asked about the landscape fabric for weed control. It is a good answer for the short term because it will kill off those weeds pretty effectively with really you not having to do anything other than put that fabric down. The problem with it long term, it really inhibits root growth. So if you've got 6 inches, especially of depth, or you've branched out into the 12, roots of plants will probably still grow down through those depths into the dirt that's underneath your bed to take advantage of some space downward as opposed to spreading out and using more of your bed. So with that, the fabric doesn't work well in the end because it retains the water, doesn't allow the water to drain as freely as it should, and then will inhibit root growth of your plants as well. Again, these are all things that we just talk about. You make your decisions on what works for you and what you're comfortable with because, again, there's usually pros and cons to everything. That fabric, again, is the best thing for weed control to begin with, but long-term, the root growth and the water retention is a concern. Cardboard, we get asked about cardboard too, putting that down. And that's kind of the middle ground. That's a bit of the best of both and not the best of either. So again, The cardboard will compost into your dirt quite nicely, and you can really layer up the cardboard, 1 sheet, 2 sheet, get into the 5 and 6 sheets. Especially once it's in the bed, if you go ahead and stomp on it, kind of thing, and get all that air out from the corrugations in the cardboard, that would be a good idea too. And then with that, the cardboard itself again will compost into the dirt, and then form that nice soil amendment kind of compost dirt that you're after as well. The drawback to that, obviously, is it's not as effective as weed control mat on the weeds, but again, will compost into the dirt. You won't know it's there in the future, and the water will drain through how it should. So that's a really nice kind of in the middle ground for taking care of the weeds, and then not having something kind of long term there get in your way of the root growth and the water retention. So now that you've got your bed all set up and filled and ready, now it's time to plant. Really, the biggest thing to consider on your plants is usually what you're going to eat. Herbs and vegetables is what we specialize in, so that's pretty much what we stick into talking about. We do some flowers as well, and to give you an idea of why we do flowers, it really is more of a kind of whole life cycle to the garden, more of an ecology to the soil and the garden itself as well. And what I mean by that is your bees, your butterflies, hummingbirds. So your bees are essential for pollination. Your butterflies and hummingbirds are really just a nice added bonus. Not essential, but they're nice to have. The flowers, the marigolds that we have, the true French marigolds, they will repel bugs naturally. So it's a really nice companion plant. And then obviously having a flower will invite the bees in as well for better pollination of your vegetables, your tomatoes, your peppers, and things like that. So with those kind of things, flowers are nice. They're not obviously the start, because you got to get a tomato to have tomatoes. But just buying a tomato plant is the beginning. You want to get yourself a fertilizer to feed that plant. And then if you can branch out a little further and get yourself a marigold, you'll usually end up with more fruits off it because of all of that. And again, that's kind of that whole, not just the tomato plant for the tomatoes. It's the tomato plant to get the tomatoes, the fertilizer to feed the tomato plant, and the bees in there to pollinate your tomatoes. So nice to kind of have that whole circle of what's going on in your garden as well. Obviously, flowers, they make you smile too. So nice to have around and look good as well. Spacing is probably the other big concern. How much can I fit in that bed? Raised beds are designed not to be overplanted, but to give you a better yield per square foot than a traditional garden. And it's back to that point of not getting up in your bed. You're not putting money into the areas that you walk in your rows. You're not watering those and weeding those, and again, spending money on fertilizer in those areas. So when you're spacing out your bed, do realize that you can plant things ordinarily that you'd plant further apart. You can put them closer, but it doesn't just mean you're getting free space, so to speak. And what I mean by that is parsley, basil, oregano, chives, all of those kind of herb plants that you're going to put in your bed. Bear in mind, again, that production side of it. So the roots and the top growth grow in tandem. If you're always cutting on the top growth, it's not putting out more roots. And again, in your raised bed, it's a limited space. So the more intensely you can farm that space, the more you can get out of that space, the quicker you're in the black from your investment to begin with, the quicker you're actually making money from your garden, or it's saving you money, kind of thing. That's, again, the aim of kind of, as you look at what to plant, how to plant it, and map it out. It's usually easier to keep your herbs together. It's usually easier to keep your vegetables together. If you've just got the one bed, you don't have to. Just make sure the big vegetables that grow big aren't shading the herb plants. So depending on how your sun kind of aspect rolls, have the herbs up the front, veggies in the back. That kind of way would be nice, because then your sun, is shining on all of your plant material instead of your herbs tucked up the back getting shaded. And then the spacing of it, if you've got a parsley plant or a basil plant that you keep nice and short, you're cutting on it at least weekly. Those things really only need to take up maybe a 4x4 or a 6x6 kind of space, and then you can plant other plants around that. What you do not want, and what you want to avoid really at all costs, is plants getting big and overcrowded. Bugs love that. Aphids, whiteflies, spider mites all love plants that are overgrown, forming this nice canopy out of direct sunlight, away from natural predators, trapping the moisture from the soil to make this nice little humid environment. And again, kind of out of your way in the line of sight from seeing that there's a problem until they've really established themselves. So do avoid letting things get overgrown. What does that look like on tomatoes and peppers and your bigger vegetables and so forth? So tomato plants, sometimes you'll get away with doing a 12 by 12. So square foot gardening is pretty popular. That is actually nice. It's kind of like paint by numbers for gardening. Tells you what to do, when to do it, how to do it, when to pull it up, when to put something back in. Visually, it gives you an idea of kind of breaking up that bed into a grid so that you can visualize. 12 by 12 space for a tomato is a little tight because you don't want, if you've got tomatoes, especially more than one together in that area, and you went ahead and put them all in a square foot right up against each other, what you'll find is usually you've got not just leaves from one plant to another kind of growing, you've got major branches crisscrossing. And again, it's just an issue for the airflow. So you want to be mindful that good airflow in your garden keeps those bugs down. It keeps it gives you a better chance of keeping out your funguses and your blights and that kind of thing, because the sun's drying your plants off, and that's really the better way to go about it. Again, what we talk about is kind of what we've observed and what we've learned here, and hopefully that's of help to you. With that, the spacing of it, a tomato plant, usually a 16 by 16 area kind of thing, 16 to 18 inches, square is a nice kind of size for a tomato that doesn't then get jammed and crammed next to something else. So again, just play with that over time and see what works for you. Your peppers, so not your sweet peppers, your big full-size sweet peppers, but more so your chilies and hot peppers. Those things you can get away with a little smaller of an area, like a 10 by 10 or that. And again, I know we're really only talking about very small inches here and there, so really don't want to get into the finer, this is exactly the space and this is exactly what to do. Try not to lock it down that tightly. We get questions that, go against. So what we talk about, so let's say, for instance, a lavender plant. A lavender plant, usually you only prune the top third of it up to a half of the plant itself is what we recommend. Some folks will run over it with a lawnmower and it's never looked better. And that's great because, again, that's kind of what gardening is, kind of learning and enjoying the process and seeing what works for you. And if it's not broke, then don't fix it. We try not to get into kind of saying this is the only way you can do it. But again, on the raised bed kind of side of it, you want to more so kind of look at your space, see that full sun and that well-drained area, and then see what works for you. And then kind of go about kind of thinking about how you get your money back out of that as quickly as possible. Going to wrap it up in a few moments, folks. If you've got any other questions, please feel free. But lastly, on the raised bed area, as you look to trellis things, look to protect things from squirrels and raccoons and things like that, couple of nice ways on a raised bed, especially, you've got the freedom, you've got your base there. So if you've got squirrels and you've got rabbits and that, then you've got yourself a foundation kind of there to build a fence on, to anchor some posts to and wrap some netting around it, which is always nice to keep them out so you get the food. Squirrels, raccoons, deer, bigger things like that, that's a little trickier. Usually you have to enclose your whole area or at least cage the bed itself, which might not be bad. I mean, obviously it just depends how much you want to eat them and not have them eaten. So it might look a little ugly and rough, but if you've got a problem going into it, it's usually better to set it up from the beginning where you've got a little less stress and more time to enjoy the bed itself rather than worrying about who's eating from it other than yourself. So hopefully that's been of help to you folks. Again, shoot us any questions and hope you enjoy your gardening. Take care.